going to present a paper on Is Fascism a Movement? Conceptual Blind Spots and Recommendations for a Reconstruction. Thank you, Seraphine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, let me also begin by thanking the organizers for this kind invitation. Let me also apologize for the rather preliminary nature of what I'm about to present, which on top of it all is also quite, or shall I say, very ambitious, seeking to examine aspects that at first may appear disparate, but in my view they are not, and I see it as a challenge to show why this is so. In its full form, my paper sets out to accomplish two major cognitive tasks, one conceptual and one theoretical. And for that purpose, it is divided into three sections. Unfortunately, all I have time to do here is focus on the first section, which centers on the nature, on the meaning of the concept social movements, approaching it from a perspective of historical semantics. Seeking to problematize and interrogate dominant understandings on the basis of the idea that with concepts, as with pretty much everything else in life, history matters. That a conceptual core which at one point in time may have been adequate may well subsequently become inadequate and analytically problematic. Anticipating my conclusion, what I want to submit to you is that loosely conceiving and calling fascism a social movement is nowadays both cognitively inappropriate, hampering instead of facilitating research, and ideologically driven, even in cases when this may not be occurring intentionally. It is a practice, therefore, which I think we must resist. The paper's theoretical goals are undertaken in the next two sections, both of which focus directly on fascism. Although, as I have just said, I'll just be scratching the surface, I think it is important to include the main tenets in the presentation. I hope you will be able to see why. But let me tell you one or two things about these truncated sections. The second section makes a leap over to history. If, as our old mentor Chuck Tilley would have it, mass socio-political phenomena always reflect interactive processes, then one extremely promising, albeit less than adequately explored route for understanding fascism is to examine strategies mastered in order to prevent its emergence, consolidation and growth. For that it is crucial, I think, to examine the two main tactics devised for that purpose by the Communist International, one of the two major forces in the interwar labor movement, the other, of course, being historical social democracy, social fascism and popular frontism. As we now know, they were both utter failures, but academically as well as politically, the reasons behind the failures are still being paid only lip service at all. And this is a serious shortcoming. This exercise in interactive history is prefatory to a third section dealing with the political nature of fascism and demonstrating that it is a profoundly systemic force, which of course runs counter both to how fascism defines itself, championing its allegedly anti-systemic nature, and to the way dominant perceptions disastrously sometimes reproduce this definition. But let me turn to the main theme, the cardinal conceptual issue. The operative question informing this section is very simple. It asks whether we are justified in thinking of fascism, both historically and as a contemporary phenomenon, as a social movement. The minute we pose the question, however, a superordinate question pops to mind, asking what is a social movement? A question to which we all know there exist several answers. In view of this, and to avoid using the term in a loose and haphazard fashion, I think it is important to undertake what Giovanni Sartori termed conceptual reconstruction. A crucial operation in the social sciences that involves singling out defining properties of predominant definitions with the goal of arriving at meaningful syntheses. In my view, and it is this to which I immediately turn, careful examination of the literature reveals at least three general classes of definitions. The first is the one provided by Tilly and associates in the tradition of contentious politics, according to which social movements are sustained campaigns of claimants aimed at authorities. The particulars of this parsimonious rendering cannot fully occupy us here, of course, but I cannot but mention that, among other things, they include the existence of special purpose associations or coalitions engaged in a particular repertoire that involves tactics such as demonstrations, petition drives, public statements and meetings, all deployed for the purpose of effecting Wung displays on the parts of the actors, an acronym denoting displays that reflect worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. Authors in the same tradition have elaborated this core conceptualization in a variety of ways. Sid Taro, for instance, defined social movements as collective challenges based on common purposes and social solidarities in sustained interaction with elites, opponents, and authorities, while Doug McAdam and David Snow have stressed the non-routine, extra-institutional, or transgressive nature of movement-related collective action. They claim that this is important and is required in order to be able to distinguish between social movements and other collective endeavors embedded in the institutional system of policy making, such as most notably interest groups and mere lobbying. As I said, however, this is not the only core definition in the literature. A second one, upheld by McCarthy and Zold, departs from understanding social movements as a species of the collective action genre, suggesting instead that we approach them as a set of opinions and beliefs, the distinguishing feature, the differentiam specificam, being that they represent preferences for changing some elements of the social structure and or reward distribution of a society. The upshot of this, which is evidently a far more abstract take at the notion, is that movements may or may not, conversely, acquire mature organizational manifestations. And this is evidently, I think, an asset. The drawback, of course, is that, as Tilly, I remember well, was very quick to point out, this way we run the risk of seeing social movements everywhere. But then again, is it not appropriate to include in our research discourses and opinion trends demanding change, even if at the moment we examine them, they have not yet become fully organized? In my own work on the labor movement, and primarily out of a need to avoid reducing movements to organizations, I have tended to answer in the negative. And so have the scholars promoting a third definition, people such as the late Alberto Melucci, and especially Mario Diani and Our Lady of Honor, Donatella della Porta, who have stressed that movements must be understood first and foremost as informal interaction networks that produce culture and collective identity, as well as engaging in protest and contentious political campaigns. So what do we do? Whom do we believe? One way out of the dilemma is to attempt synthesis by moving up on the ladder of abstraction, that is, by decreasing the number of the defining properties in order to enlarge the denotation, the reference. This could take the form of a definition claiming that movements are transgressive collective challenges to authorities with different degrees of organization, a definition both inclusive of the main cognitive objectives of the three traditions and avoiding the usual pitfall of concept stretching. But would that be really adequate? Well, my concern is that if we decided to proceed this way, that is, to define social movements as opinion and preference networks as well as extra-institutional political endeavors of claimants, would end up with a concept that, in my view, would be overly abstract, relying on properties which, though themselves crucial, are ultimately limited in terms of their discerning capacity. This is a problem Sartori identified in his famous 1991 paper about concepts that refer to too many substantively dissimilar phenomena, in our case instructing us to think of and research phenomena such as the labor movement, the anti-globalization movement, the environmental movement, the same way that we think and research religious fundamentalism, the Ku Klux Klan, and ultimately fascism. I think that one key reason for that is that the conceptualizations I sketched tend to approach social movements in what I would claim is an overly procedural manner, without paying enough attention to policy content, without paying attention, that is, to the substance of the demands that are being aired. I claim that it is this severance of the concept from its substantive underpinnings, what we may construe as a loss of ideational anchorage, which causes us to treat fascism and other insidious reflections of global systemic impasse as social movements. I think this is a serious drawback. Concepts come about because they implement notions, and the notion of social movement, le mouvement social, is eminently located and loaded with the idea of popular empowerment. The notion social movement was first introduced in 1848 by German economist and sociologist Lawrence Voss-Sein in a book titled Socialist and Communist Movements Since the Third French Revolution, and subsequently, 2 years later, in his History of the French Social Movement from 1789 to the present. The meaning he intended, what he named, what he wanted to name terming the phenomenon social movements, in his case, principally, were struggles of ordinary people fighting for social rights. In his case, principally understood as welfare rights. Tilly himself also echoed this view when he suggested that social movements are first and foremost about the assertion of popular sovereignty. Precisely in order to re-establish this ideational semantic link, I suggest that a key defining property of the concept, flowing from the historic notion it seeks to implement, ought to be a drive towards democratization, a notion I borrow from historian Geoff Ely, his book Forging Democracy. To so argue, of course, may be criticized as normative or ideological, a stance simply opting to exclude from the purview of the concept phenomena we simply do not like, such as fascism, the ISIS, etc. Responding to this, I claim that in reality it is precisely the other way around. The motive behind contemporary political commentators and journalists, and some academics, of course, eagerness to adopt an expansive use of the concept is not cognitive or analytical, but on the contrary, eminently ideological and normative. The goal is to delegitimize movements, which itself is an analytically pernicious regression to the theoretical dictates of collective behavior, according to which anything that does not comply to the rules of the game is equally malicious and undemocratic. Precisely the stance scholars such as McAdam have pointedly dubbed the pluralist prejudice. So let me stress that the key reason for adopting a substantive conceptualization of social movements is not normative, it's analytical. So let me repeat that the reason we need a qualitative discerning definition is that we must guard against crowding the concept's denotation, its reference, with political entities and social phenomena which, though superficially or even apparently similar to social movements, are fundamentally dissimilar. Once again, to use one of Sartori's favorite metaphors, in concept building, we must guard against coming up with what he used to say strange bedfellows. stipulating conceptual similarity between, as he put it back in 1970 in his classic Concept of Information and Comparative Politics, between human beings and fish, simply because they can both swim. So let me stress that the reason for wanting to keep fascism and the social movements conceptually distinct is not because we like social movements but detest fascism, but because we need different subsidiary concepts in different research hypotheses in order to be able to adequately study each one of them. Failing to do that is bound to lead to poor theory that doesn't make much sense, may be correct, but who needs it? Or even worse, to no theory at all. And can you imagine the state of medicine if medical researchers were trying to establish theory about both of these mammals? Last but not least, we must also be alert to the cognitive function that a concept of social movement needs to perform in the present time. Such a temporal concern often goes unnoticed, but as scholars such as Michael Keating, whom Donatella knows and has cooperated with, have pointed out, this is an extremely important dimension. Concepts are built to perform specific cognitive functions, Keating tells us, but these functions change over time. I mean that even if the broad procedural concepts, social movements simply as extra-institutional claims or networks, were sufficient 1 or 2 decades ago when fascism and the far right were presumed dead, and all we had in mind when using the procedural definition were projects seeking popular empowerment, nowadays this is obviously not the case. With fascism's and religious fundamentalism's massive re-emergence, it is imperative to reconceptualize. And in this connection, it is perhaps instructive to consider that this is also what happened with the historical semantics of another key concept in political science, democracy. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, democracy was considered as identical to what today we would call competitive oligarchy, constitutional government pure and simple, even if it lacked universal suffrage. This is Britain. When universal suffrage was granted, however, a conceptual distinction narrowing democracy's denotation by adding the property universal suffrage became imperative. The same now holds true with social movements. In my view, nowadays it is imperative to provide a new term distinguishing them from, that is, social movements from fascism and other mass political projects that bear no democratizing drive. For that purpose, I would provisionally suggest counter-movements. The concept is not entirely new, of course. It has been introduced by McCarthy and Zold in their famous 1977 paper as, quite prosaically, a set of opinions and beliefs opposed to social movements. This, of course, begs the question of what is a social movement, but if we begin thinking of social movements the way I suggest as extra-institutional collective challenges that seek democratization as popular empowerment, counter-movements are typically collective political endeavors resisting democratization. This would take care of the crucial dimension, substantive policy content, but quite obviously we need more in order to make the concept empirically adequate. And on this I can cite work we've been doing at the Laboratory on Contentious Politics, especially the work of Lucia Kotronaki, who in a paper published in 2018 suggested that counter-movements can be empirically discerned on the basis of the following dimensions. The resources they mobilize, whereas movements rely on resource-poor mass constituencies, counter-movements draw on privileged, albeit often invisible, links to the elites and the state. Repertoires, while movements employ wound displays, counter-movements use military tactics akin to the police and parastate militias. Organizational modalities, whereas movements typically seek deliberation and accountability, counter-movements promote top-down hierarchies, often implementing varieties of Führership. Finally, temporality of emergence, with counter-movements emerging after the exhaustion or failure of movement upsurges. Time is already running short, but I can use this last bit about temporalities of emergence in order to highlight some of my theoretical themes. As I said, the first turns to history. With an eye to building upon fascism's interactive character, I take this part of the exercise to be theoretical, because as the field of contentious politics has amply demonstrated, analyzing mass phenomena requires that we pay attention not only to them as such, but also to the ways their socio-political and symbolic environment affects them. This requires that we seriously revisit the two main tactics the historic labor movement mastered, as I said earlier, in the 20s and 30s, in order to address the fascist threat, the doctrine of social fascism, also known as third periodism, and popular frontism. Both policies were dictated by the thoroughly Stalinized Communist International. Accordingly, the 6th Congress of August 1928 proclaimed that whoever is not with us is a concealed fascist, hence the term social fascism. Well, a few years down the road, in August 1935, at the 7th Congress, popular frontism did the exact opposite, proclaiming that whoever is not against us is with us, an ally. In the first instance, the tactic paralyzed the labor movement, producing deep splits and acerbic animosity within its ranks. In the second, because it effectively dented its programmatic surge towards a democratic socialist alternative to crisis-ridden capitalism. Any thorough discussion of these tactics' particulars and the reasons for their failure would naturally take us to fascism's fundamental nature, especially the role of big business, to recall Daniel Guérin's classic title. The discussion is marred nowadays, however, by what Michael Mann has provocatively termed clasturbation, an exclusively sociological approach, typically refuting the relationship between capitalism, fascism, and politics, and fascism on the basis of the paucity of data demonstrating a direct instrumentalist link between the two. But this is tantamount to deciding the issue before even setting out to research it. I suggest, in turn, that it is important both to bring politics back in and ground the analysis in the realization that as fascism emerged in times of organic crisis, both in the 30s and in the present time, we cannot truly come to grips with its nature unless we approach it as reaction to the kinds of situations Donatella was talking about, system disequilibration, attempting a systemic re-equilibration in an authoritarian, totalitarian direction. And it must also not escape our attention that this has also served as a means to avoid the alternative route, deepening democracy, extending it to the socio-economic sphere. In conclusion, let me just say that from a different route, this also serves as a reminder of the need to begin conceiving fascism not as a social movement, but as a reactionary social counter-movement. Thank you.